The room went dead silent when she froze at the bedside. Elena Martinez moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU at 6 in the morning, the fluorescent lights humming above polished linoleum that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. She'd been volunteering for the isolation rooms nobody wanted for 2 years now, the complex cases that made other nurses uncomfortable, the pediatric traumas that required something beyond protocol. Moving through the ward with quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible, she wiped down monitors with the precision of someone who'd learned to function under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. When she reached for supplies on the 3rd floor, her sleeve rode up revealing burned scars that trailed from wrist to elbow like a topographical map of fire and time. She pulled the fabric down without looking at it. The scars were information. Pain is data. She'd learned that in a place that no one here would ever need to know about. A transfer arrived from the VA at 7:48 a.m. General Marcus Hayes, 56, Special Forces background, listed as disabled with multiple combat injuries and pneumonia developing in his left lung. The paramedics wheeled him in on a stretcher with the careful movements of people who knew they were transporting something broken, something that had been broken for years. Elena received the handoff report in the hallway, clipboard in hand, listening to the EMS chief describe the vitals with the clipped efficiency of someone who'd made this run 1,000 times. O2 sat 81% on supplemental oxygen. Heart rate elevated. Temperature spiking. The general's eyes were closed, his breathing labored, the sound of a man whose lungs had forgotten how to work without assistance. She walked into his room at 7:52 a.m. The dog tag was the first thing she saw. Single tag on a broken chain, the metal dull from years of wear, hanging against his chest just below the hospital gown. Elena froze. Her hand stopped moving. The clipboard slipped slightly in her grip, and for a moment, just a moment, the room tilted. The unit designation. The exact same unit her son wore on a chain identical to this one. Helmand Province. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. She swallowed once, hard, and her fingers moved forward without her permission, reaching for the chart at the foot of his bed. The general remained unconscious, his breathing mechanical, his body a collection of injuries that had been stitched and taped and medicated back into something resembling function. Elena's eyes moved to his shoulder, to the pale surgical scar visible through the fabric of his hospital gown, and her breath caught in her throat. She knew that scar. Not personally, not in the sense of having caused it, but she knew the pattern of it. The precision. The field medicine that had been applied under fire, probably in the dark, probably while rounds were coming down. She'd seen scars like that before. She'd made scars like that, once upon a time, when she was a different person with a different rank and a different life. Dr. Caldwell entered the room during morning rounds at 8:14 a.m. He was tall, thin in the way of men who jogged before dawn and ate salads with documented portions, with silver hair that looked like it had been cut by someone who understood what authority looked like when it was reflected in a mirror. His presence moved ahead of him like a pressure wave, the kind of calm that comes from knowing that every door would open when you approached it. He moved to the general's bedside with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been questioned, and his eyes, pale blue, the color of shallow water, caught Elena standing there with her hand still on the chart. She pulled her hand away. Slowly. Her sleeve dropped back over the scars, and she stepped backward into the posture that came naturally to her, the one that took up less space, that apologized for existing. "Good morning, Doctor," she said quietly, her voice pitched low. "Vitals are stable. Respiration assisted. I've ordered the antibiotic protocol as requested." Caldwell didn't acknowledge her immediately. He was staring at her, and she could see the moment his eyes moved to the general's shoulder, to the scar, to her face, back to the scar. His gaze was like a spotlight searching through darkness. She could see the gears turning. Whatever he saw in that moment, whatever he calculated, his expression closed like a door. "How long have you been working in the ICU?" he asked, his voice casual, the kind of casual that masks something underneath. 2 years, Doctor," she said. The tremor in her hands was small, controllable. She kept them at her sides. "And you volunteer for the difficult cases?" "I do." "Interesting." He made a note on his tablet, the stylus moving with quick, deliberate strokes. His eyes didn't leave the chart, but she could feel his attention on her like heat from an overhead lamp. You'll be Hayes's primary nurse. I want detailed observations. Behavior changes, consciousness level, any unusual responses. Everything documented. It wasn't a request. It was an assignment that felt like being placed under a microscope. Elena nodded, and Caldwell left the room, his white coat trailing behind him like something with its own momentum. She stood alone with the general then, and her eyes returned to the dog tag. The broken chain. The weight of what it meant. Her son had called last week, a quick phone conversation that lasted for minutes, the kind of call that happened between deployments, the kind where he couldn't say where he was or what he was doing, but he could say that the general had saved his unit twice, that Hayes was the reason they'd all come home. That Hayes was the reason he had come home. The door opened again. 3 other nurses entered for the morning shift change, and Elena moved into the neutral space she'd perfected over the last 2 years. She became helpful. She became background. She became the kind of nurse that people looked through instead of at. But her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd been trained by people who understood that mistakes in certain kinds of work resulted in people not coming home. She inserted and for with the kind of smooth competence that took years to develop, and when one of the other nurses said, "Elena, you're like a machine," she almost smiled. The smile would have been dangerous, so she didn't let it reach her face. Around 10 in the morning, a loud crash came from the trauma bay 3 rooms over. Something heavy had hit the floor. Elena's shoulders locked for half a second. Just half a second. Her body had responded before her mind could catch it, the ancient muscle memory activating, incoming fire, find cover, establish perimeter. Her coworker, Jenny, didn't even notice. Jenny was already moving toward the sound to help with whatever had broken. Elena took a breath and returned to her charting, her hand steady again, the moment contained. But Caldwell was standing in the hallway outside the observation window. He'd seen that half-second response. She was certain of it. His eyes met hers for just long enough to confirm that he'd catalogued this information too, filed it away alongside the scars and the frozen moment at the bedside and the way she'd looked at the dog tag like it was the most important thing in the world. He looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle with pieces he doesn't yet understand, but is already beginning to see the picture they might make. That afternoon, she overheard him in the break room talking with 2 senior nurses about staffing for the weekend. His voice was mild, conversational, the kind of tone that made what he was saying feel less like an accusation and more like an observation. "That Martinez," he said, and Elena's hands went still over the coffee pot she was holding. "The wannabe hero. Always volunteering for the hard cases. Probably because she's got something to prove. You know that type. No real qualifications, just determination and a martyr complex." He laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "Let's see how long that lasts when things actually get difficult." Elena poured her coffee without turning around. The cup was warm in her hands. The burn on her forearms remembered worse heat than this. She drank it black, standing alone at the edge of the break room, and when the other nurses glanced at her with apologetic expressions, she smiled at them with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived things that would break most people. "I'm going on break," she said quietly, and walked past them toward the stairwell. The door to the stairwell closed behind her, and for a moment she stood in the concrete silence of a space nobody used. She pulled her sleeve up. Looked at the scars. Looked at the dog tag memory in her mind, the broken chain, the unit designation, the impossible coincidence of a general from her son's battalion arriving at her hospital the day after she'd decided she was done being invisible. The day after she'd chosen to hide everything that she was beneath a name and a scrub's uniform and a willingness to work the shifts no one else wanted. Pain is data, she thought. And the data was telling her that Dr. Caldwell had just marked her as a threat without understanding what kind of threat she actually was. The next words out of his mouth, when they came, would change everything. The overhead page crackled across every floor of Oak Creek Memorial at 1,400 hours, a sound like static bleeding through the walls. "Martinez, the wannabe hero, to administration immediately." Elena's hand stilled on the medication cart. Around her, ICU nurses exchanged glances, some smirking, others looking suddenly very focused on their computers. She set down the four tubing with the same precision she'd learned to apply to rifles and medical supplies in equal measure, smoothed her scrubs, and walked toward the administrative wing with measured steps. Her jaw tightened, but her face remained composed, the kind of composure that came from having once walked through Helmand Province with bullets calling her name. The walk to administration took 4 minutes. Elena counted them. The hallway fluorescent lights hummed their artificial rhythm, a sound that had never bothered her until now, too bright, too exposed, too many windows. When she arrived at the administrative office, the receptionist looked confused. "I'm sorry, we didn't page for anyone." "There must be a mistake." Elena stood motionless for 3 seconds, then turned and walked back toward the ICU. She understood now. It wasn't a summons. It was a show. A demonstration to the entire nursing staff that Dr. Caldwell could move her like a chess piece, that her presence in his domain was unstable, questionable, temporary. When she returned to the ICU, Caldwell was waiting in the physician's lounge with a slight smile on his face, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who'd just watched his trap spring without needing to pull the trigger himself. He didn't acknowledge her directly. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered through the hospital's intercom system, *she* was the problem. That afternoon, during shift change when the ward was a controlled chaos of departing and arriving staff, Caldwell cornered her in the supply closet. He moved with the confidence of a man who understood institutional power the way other men understood breathing, as something so fundamental it required no thought. The closet was narrow, shelves stacked with saline bags and syringes and bandage rolls, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and cardboard boxes. He blocked the doorway with his body, shoulders filling the frame. "I've been reviewing your file, Martinez." His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been told no. Interesting how someone with just an associate degree keeps catching things the doctors miss. "Makes me wonder what you're really doing here." His breath smelled of coffee and mints as he leaned closer, invading the space the way predators do when they want their prey to understand the distance between hunter and hunted. "I've heard rumors you worked somewhere else before this." "Military hospital, maybe?" That would explain the paranoia. Elena didn't move. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers curled but not clenched. The sound of nurses changing shift echoed from the hallway outside, wheels on tile, voices calling for hand-off reports, the ordinary percussion of a functioning medical unit. She listened to it the way she'd once listened to distant helicopter rotors, cataloging every detail. "I'm going to make this simple," Caldwell continued, his confidence absolute. "Request a transfer to another hospital by Friday, or I'll ensure you never work in Portland again. I have that authority. One phone call to the licensing board mentioning concerns about your competency, and every facility within 200 miles will have your file flagged for review. Are we clear?" Elena took one measured breath. In that exhale, she felt something crack inside her, not her composure, but the careful separation she'd maintained between who she'd been and who she was pretending to be. A single tear escaped down her cheek, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her hand moving with the same steady precision she'd once used to apply tourniquets in the dust. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that someone standing in the hallway wouldn't have heard her. "You're making a mistake you don't understand yet." Caldwell laughed, a sharp bark that bounced off the metal shelves. "Is that a threat?" From a nurse. He stepped back, convinced he'd won, convinced that the tear she'd allowed to fall was surrender rather than something else entirely. "Friday, Martinez. You have 3 days to decide if your career here is worth preserving." The next morning at 0600, Elena arrived for the general ward assignment that Caldwell had already processed without her knowledge. The charge nurse handed her a tablet with patient assignments that kept her far from the ICU, post-surgical patients on their discharge days, routine medication administration, nothing that would bring her into Caldwell's territory or line of sight. The assignments were designed like a cage, busy enough to occupy her time, mundane enough to bore her into compliance, far enough away that she couldn't observe what was happening in the rooms she could no longer access. At 09:45, while she was standing in the medication room checking dosages against electronic records, Elena overheard two ICU nurses talking on the other side of the supply shelf. Their voices were low but not cautious enough. "Hayes crashed twice overnight. Caldwell had to intubate him." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elena's hand stilled on the medication cart. She could see in her mind the exact sequence: a general with breathing already compromised, an airway that would resist, the intubation tube sliding past vocal cords that shouldn't need it, not yet, not unless something was preventing his lungs from doing their job on their own. At 1100, she invented a reason to walk past the ICU. Labs that could have gone through the pneumatic tube system were instead carried by hand, a delay that no one would question. Through the window into Hayes's room, she could see his monitor displaying pressures that sat just slightly wrong, his breathing labored even with the ventilator doing the work. The rhythm was off, too much sedation, or not enough oxygenation, or something in between that only someone looking would have noticed. Caldwell was nowhere visible. She returned to the general ward where her charge nurse assigned her to discharge paperwork for the rest of the shift, which meant sitting at a computer, paperwork shielding her line of sight to the monitors, paperwork ensuring she had no reason to move. But the code blue alarm still reached her ears at 1400 hours. The sound cut through the general ward like a siren cutting through night, high-pitched, insistent, demanding. Another nurse mentioned it: Hayes. Elena's hands clenched the paper she was holding hard enough to crumple it. She counted the seconds on the wall clock. 18 minutes. 18 minutes is a long code, long enough that usually the outcome is already decided somewhere between minute 3 and minute 12. When it cleared, she checked the system without drawing attention. Hayes was listed as stable but transferred to a different room, one without window visibility from the hallway. One without observation. That evening, Elena stayed late, reorganizing supply carts on the general ward until most staff had left, moving with the kind of patience that came from experience with waiting. At 19:20, she watched Caldwell leave through the parking lot, briefcase in hand, the kind of briefcase that held records and phone calls and future leverage. She waited 15 minutes, then took the stairs to the ICU instead of the elevator, quieter, less visible. The charge nurse was in a patient room, the ward quiet during shift change overlap, that moment when one shift's exhaustion hasn't quite transferred to the next shift's alertness. Elena slipped into Hayes's room. His vitals on the monitor showed stabilization that felt artificial, pressures held by medications rather than recovery, a body being maintained rather than healed. She accessed his chart on the computer with the password they'd all been given, checking the medication orders. Standard postcode protocol should have included specific drugs at specific intervals. What she found instead were dosages slightly off, timing irregular, patterns that suggested someone was managing his condition down rather than managing it toward recovery. She photographed 3 pages with her phone, her hand steady now that the decision had been made. She knew what she was documenting. She knew what it meant. She knew what it would cost. When she exited the room, a nursing assistant was watching from the hallway, a young man whose eyes went wide when he recognized her. Elena nodded calmly, as if she had every right to be there, which was true and false at the same time. She returned to the general ward, knowing that by morning, Caldwell would know she'd violated his boundary, knowing that her 3-day window was about to collapse. The badge reader at the general ward entrance beeped at 0600 sharp, and Elena Martinez clipped her hospital ID back to her scrub pocket with the same precision she'd used to secure night vision goggles 17 years ago. The general ward assignments were on the bulletin board: post-surgical recovery, medication administration, routine vitals every 4 hours, the kind of work designed to keep her away from critical care entirely, away from General Hayes, away from whatever Caldwell feared she'd already seen. The hallway smelled like breakfast trays and antiseptic, that particular institutional blend that never quite masked the underside of human suffering. She didn't pause. She didn't check her phone. She moved to room for 12 where Mrs. Chen was waiting for her morning medications, and began the work of being exactly what Caldwell wanted her to be: invisible. At 0630, her badge stopped working on the administrative corridor door. She was between rooms when security found her, a young officer who wouldn't meet her eyes as he asked her to step outside for a moment. Not a request. Not even phrased as one. Elena followed, her hand steady, her breathing level, and when she arrived at the small conference room adjacent to Caldwell's office, he was already sitting there with her access badge on the table between them like evidence. "You were in the ICU last night," Caldwell said. His voice was controlled, almost friendly. This was a different Caldwell than the one who'd confronted her in the supply closet. This Caldwell had woken up strategizing. In a patient room. After being explicitly removed from critical care. Elena said nothing. The room was cold. The fluorescent light overhead had a faint electrical hum that made her teeth ache. "I'm restricting your building access," he continued, sliding a printed authorization across the table. "General ward only. Pediatric unit only. You'll badge in and out with security monitoring every shift. Any deviation from assigned units, and you're terminated immediately. Not suspended. Terminated." He paused, letting that word settle. "Do you understand?" "Yes, Dr. Caldwell." He picked up his desk phone and dialed without looking away from her. "This is Dr. Caldwell in administration. I need to flag a staff member for boundary concerns." He gave her name. He described her as having unauthorized access to restricted patients. His voice was smooth as oil. "Special interest in military patients." "Yes. The VA liaison needs to know." He hung up and made a second call before she'd finished processing the first. This one to hospital security, documenting her pattern of concerning behavior, requesting her access card be programmed with restrictions and alerts if she attempted to enter prohibited areas. Elena watched him. She did not blink. She did not look away. She did not let her hands clench into fists because the trembling wasn't fear, it was something deeper, something forged in helm and province and never quite extinguished. Restraint. Control. The knowledge that whatever she did in this moment would echo through decisions she hadn't even made yet. "General Hayes's medication orders are incorrect," she said quietly. Caldwell's expression didn't change. He set the phone in its cradle with careful deliberation. "That's above your pay grade, Martinez. Way above it. You're a pediatric ICU nurse masquerading as a general ward nurse now. You don't diagnose. You don't question physician orders. You follow protocol. Dismissed." She stood. Her legs worked. The door opened and closed and she was in the hallway, and her restricted access badge was in her pocket, and she understood with crystalline clarity that Caldwell had just revealed his entire strategy in a single 15-minute conversation. He wasn't just isolating her anymore. He was documenting her. Creating a paper trail that would make her termination look justified when it came. When it came. Not if. The general ward felt smaller that morning. The nursing station was too bright. Her colleagues moved around her with the careful distance people maintain around someone who's been flagged, and Elena realized that security must have already called down, must have already notified the charge nurse that this staff member required monitoring. By noon, 3 different nurses had asked if she was okay, their voices pitched with that particular sympathy that meant they'd already decided her fate. By 13:30, while she was helping a patient named Mr. Rodriguez to the bathroom after his bowel regimen, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from a young ICU nurse named Keisha, someone Elena had trained 6 months ago on how to recognize early signs of sepsis in pediatric patients. Hayes crashing. Caldwell in surgery. Code team 7-minute out. Thought you should know. Elena's heart rate climbed to somewhere north of 100. She told Mr. Rodriguez to use his call light when he was finished, that she'd be right back. She didn't run. Running would trigger alerts from security cameras. But she walked with purpose, with the kind of movement that said she belonged everywhere, and when she reached the ICU entrance, her badge wouldn't read. The electronic lock held. The door didn't open. She stood there for 43 seconds, her jaw tight, her hands pressed against the cool metal frame, and then the doors parted as a respiratory therapist exited and she slipped through in his wake like she was the other side of a mirror. The ICU was in that particular controlled chaos of a code response, alarms muted, voices pitched low, the organized pandemonium of people who'd trained for exactly this. But Hayes's room was empty of staff. The monitors showed the answer in their red displays: oxygen saturation dropping, chest wall moving asymmetrically on the left side, tension pneumothorax, the sucking chest wound from his original injury finally failing under the stress of whatever Caldwell had or hadn't done. The code team was still minutes out. Elena could hear them mobilizing downstairs, calling for the elevator. 3 minutes, maybe 4. The clear plastic bag of Hayes's personal effects was on the bedside table, a leather wallet, a broken dog tag chain, a sealed MRE package he'd apparently brought with him. Elena grabbed the MRE package and tore it open in 3 smooth motions, tear the main pouch, extract the flameless ration heater, grab the inner aluminum packaging. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this in the dark, in the rain, in the roar of helicopter rotors with medics shouting trajectory estimates. She sealed the wound with the makeshift barrier, her fingers pressing the edges in place as Hayes's oxygen saturation began its climb. 75, 82. 88, the asymmetrical chest movement stopped. His breathing became easier, the work of inhalation dropping from critical to merely desperate. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's rhythmic hiss beneath the ongoing alarm chorus. Elena stepped back just as footsteps thundered in the hallway. The code team arrived with crash cart and medications, and she moved toward the corner, just another nurse, just someone helping, nothing remarkable, when the door frame filled with Dr. Caldwell, still wearing his surgical cap from the OR, still wearing his gloves. He saw her. He saw the improvised chest seal. He saw Hayes's vital signs climbing, and he saw Elena Martinez standing 3 feet away with blood on her hands, and understanding bloomed across Caldwell's face like a flower in fast motion. Not the understanding of a man watching a medical emergency resolved. The understanding of a man watching evidence walk away in scrubs. That was when the real nightmare began. By 1800, security was escorting her out through the main atrium. By 1805, she was in the employee parking garage, holding a suspension notice printed in black and white, practicing beyond scope of license without authorization. Practicing medicine without a license. The words blurred together. Her badge was gone. Her privileges were gone. The parking garage smelled like diesel and wet concrete and the particular despair of fluorescent lighting in a space no one chose to occupy at this hour. She sat in her car for 6 minutes before her hand stopped shaking enough to turn the key. The next morning, Elena came back for the things she couldn't leave behind: her personal mug, a photo from before Helmand, the small notebook where she kept medication schedules. The hospital laundry room was empty at 05:05, just the smell of industrial detergent and warm fabric and the low hum of machines that ran 24 hours a day. She pulled her scrubs from her locker, all of them now superfluous, and began folding them with military corners. Crease. Fold. Crease. The precision of ritual. The muscle memory of a life before this one, before Oak Creek Memorial, before Dr. Caldwell had decided that a quiet nurse with too much competence was a threat worth destroying. Her hands were shaking. Not from weakness. From the effort of not throwing the folded scrubs at the wall. Not from fear. From rage. The attendant pretended not to notice, reorganizing linens with studied intensity, both of them locked in that particular courtesy that surrounds professional disasters. Elena finished folding the last set of scrubs, straightened the stack with a final crease, and placed them on the shelf she'd used 1,000 times before. This was the final indignity. Not the public humiliation. Not the suspension notice. Not even the loss of a career she'd spent months rebuilding after Helmand Province had tried to take everything from her. It was this small, private moment in a laundry room where no one would ever know that she'd just folded her life into neat, rectangular packages and left them on a shelf. General Hayes's monitor began its descent at 14:32, a downward cascade that started soft and ended catastrophic. His oxygen saturation dropped from 94 to 87 to 79, each digit a small death, and his chest wall had begun to collapse inward on itself like a building imploding. Tension pneumothorax. His original wound from the ambush, the one that should have killed him in Helmand province but hadn't, the one that had haunted Elena for 7 years, had ruptured. The attending physician was in OR, mid-surgery, unreachable. The code team was 7 minutes out. Caldwell wasn't answering his page, though Elena would later learn he'd heard it and chosen silence, deliberately absent because a General Hayes who coded was a General Hayes whose chart he might need to rewrite. Elena moved without permission. Without protocol. Without the authorization that Caldwell had stripped from her 36 hours earlier when he'd yanked her from the ICU and reassigned her to general ward, a move designed to keep her away from patients who mattered, away from cases that required actual competence. She was supposed to be delivering discharge paperwork to room 412. Instead, she was at Hayes's bedside, reading his vitals the way other people read headlines, understanding immediately what had to happen in the next 90 seconds or what wouldn't happen at all. His breathing had become shallow, rapid, the physical signature of a body beginning to shut down. Subcutaneous emphysema creeping up his neck like frost spreading across a window. No time for a chest tube. No time for proper ventilation. No time for anything except the muscle memory that lived in her hands and the protocols she'd sworn she'd left buried in the desert. She moved to his supply table and found what she needed without searching. His personal effects bag. His MRE, a meal ready to eat, still in his belongings because Hayes, like every soldier Elena had known, never threw away rations. She tore open the cardboard package with her teeth, a gesture so automatic it belonged to someone else, someone she'd been before Portland, before Scrubs, before a life constructed on the foundation of pretending to be ordinary. Her hands already knew what to do. The plastic film from inside the packaging. A piece of tape from the bedside monitor. The second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her memory from a field hospital in Sanjin Valley where she'd done this procedure while mortars fell and dust filled the air like the whole world was dissolving into sand. The needle went in. Not the usual equipment. Not proper technique by hospital standards. But effective. The hiss of trapped air escaping sounded like a sigh of relief. Hayes's oxygen began climbing immediately. 79. 82. 88. The color returning to his face like someone was adjusting the saturation on a photograph. His breathing normalized within seconds. His heart rate dropped from 130 to 110 to 98. The monitor's frantic beeping downshifted to something almost peaceful, something that meant a man was going to survive the next 5 minutes because a nurse had known exactly what to do in a way that pediatric nurses working in Portland don't typically know. The attending physician arrived at 14:39, still in surgical mask and cap, and stopped at the threshold. She stared at Hayes's vitals, at the improvised chest seal, at Elena's hands still positioned exactly where they needed to be, steady as surgical lasers. The attending's eyes moved to Elena and held. A long moment passed, the kind where understanding starts to dawn on someone's face like sunrise. "This is field medicine," the attending said quietly. Not a question. An observation. A recognition. "Where did you learn this?" Elena didn't answer. She was already stepping back, already returning to the space behind the white coat, already becoming invisible again. But she'd waited too long. The footsteps in the hallway had already stopped. The voice behind her was Caldwell's, and when she turned, he was still in his surgical cap, still wearing the authoritative posture of someone who'd just come from the OR where his competence was unquestioned. His eyes moved across the scene, Hayes stabilizing. The MRE packaging. The chest seal. Elena's position. The attending's expression of confusion and something like admiration. Caldwell's face went carefully blank. The kind of blank that happens when someone sees confirmation of something they've been terrified to confirm. He could read the scene instantly, could understand that Elena had not fumbled through a procedure she'd looked up on YouTube, but had executed it with the kind of precision that comes from repetition, from desperation, from having done it under fire. "Everyone out except Code Team," Caldwell said. His voice was flat. Controlled. Dangerous in its evenness. Elena left without a word. She knew what was coming. The attending would want to know what had just happened. Caldwell would have explanations ready. And the machinery of institutional protection would begin its work immediately, because Caldwell was not a man who lost control of narratives. He was a man who rewrote them. She was called to HR at 14:52. 20 minutes. That's all it took. She found out later that Caldwell had made his first call at 14:44 to the hospital board. "We have a critical compliance issue. A pediatric nurse just performed emergency field surgery on a military patient without authorization. Possible scope of practice violation. Possible security breach involving a classified patient." The second call went to the VA liaison at 14:44. "I need to report a potential breach of security protocol involving a disabled veteran currently in our care. A civilian staff member performed an authorized medical intervention." The third call was to risk management at 14:51. "Elena Martinez's credentials need to be flagged for immediate review. Field surgery training. Special Forces background. Possible dual credentialing violation." The HR administrator, a woman named Carol who'd never met Elena before, read from a script that had been typed up in real time between phone calls. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation into practicing beyond your authorized scope without physician authorization." The words came out like they'd been rehearsed, though Elena knew they hadn't been. Caldwell had simply called and constructed this version of events so completely that it was already written down by the time Elena reached the third floor. Security escorted her out at 16:45. Not roughly. Not rudely. Just professionally, efficiently, a man doing his job who'd probably been doing this same escort walk for 10 years and saw no reason it should be different this time. Elena carried a small box she'd been given time to pack. Her coffee mug. A framed photo of her son in his dress uniform, taken 6 years ago when he'd graduated from the academy. Some papers she didn't bother reading. Other nurses watched from doorways, whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. She'd been the one who'd pulled their patients back from the edge. She'd been the one who'd volunteered for impossible shifts and double shifts and holidays. And now she was the one being walked out with a security guard. She didn't cry. She didn't protest the escort. She walked with her back straight, the kind of posture that comes from understanding that this moment was temporary, that dignity was what you maintained when everything else was being stripped away. The kind of composure that belonged to someone who'd learned long ago that pain is data, that crisis reveals capacity, and that the only thing you control in situations you can't control is how you carry yourself through them. That night, in her apartment in southeast Portland, Elena sat at her kitchen table and stared at her son's photograph. He was 24 now, captain in the 75th Ranger Regiment, stationed at Fort Benning. He didn't know she'd been fired. He didn't know his mother had just lost her second career in 7 years. She wondered if she should call him, tell him what had happened, let him carry some part of this weight. She picked up her phone 3 times and put it down without dialing. The next morning, she returned to Oak Creek Memorial one final time. Not as an employee. Not as a patient. As someone coming to complete a ritual. She walked through the service entrance, past the loading dock where the smell of industrial bleach mixed with the scent of rain-soaked concrete. The laundry room was in the basement, a vast space filled with the hiss of industrial washers and the chemical warmth of dryers running in sequence. An attendant she didn't recognize looked up from folding hospital blankets. Elena opened the small package she'd brought, her 5 pairs of scrubs, still in her work locker. She set them on the folding table and began creasing them with the same precision she'd once used to prepare field dressing kits. Military corners. Every edge aligned perfectly. The attendant pretended not to notice that her hands were shaking, the first time Elena had allowed her composure to crack even slightly, not from fear but from something stranger, the finality of it. The symbolic weight of folding away a life she'd tried to build. She finished the 5th pair, stacked them precisely, and set her name badge on top. She was walking toward the service exit when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. Portland area code. She almost didn't answer. But something made her stop, made her press the phone to her ear. Major Martinez. The voice was military. Command presence. No question mark at the end because the caller wasn't asking, was already certain. This is Colonel Chen, Walter Reed Medical Center. We've been attempting to reach you regarding General Hayes. You need to come inside the hospital immediately. There's a situation. Elena didn't ask what situation. She hung up and sat in her car in the parking garage, engine off, staring at the concrete wall. 48 hours. That's all it had taken to dismantle what she'd rebuilt. But something about the colonel's voice had carried a weight that suggested the next 48 hours might be entirely different. She reached for her keys. Then her phone rang again. The Black Hawks landed on Oak Creek Memorial's helipad at dawn, rotors thrashing the Portland air into submission, and Elena was in her car on level 3 of the parking garage when her phone rang. A colonel's voice, clipped and precise, Major Martinez, what's your location? The word major hung in the air like a detonation. She didn't answer the question. She simply got out of the car and walked toward the elevator, her hand steady on the button. The same hand that had folded her scrub 17 hours earlier. The same hand that had been shaking then, though not from fear. From restraint. Her son emerged from the lead helicopter in full dress uniform, 5th Marine Regiment insignia sharp on his collar, his jaw set with the kind of purpose that made security detail step back before he'd even spoken. He strode through the hospital's main entrance with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent the last 8 years moving through rooms where mistakes meant body bags. The administrative wing. Caldwell's office. The door opened without a knock. Caldwell looked up from his desk, pale, already pulling up documentation on his computer screen, the same screen that had displayed Elena's suspension notice the previous morning. Her son didn't sit. Didn't remove his cover. His voice dropped to the register used in briefing rooms. You suspended Major Elena Martinez, the surgeon who saved General Marcus Hayes and 17 other operators in Helmand Province. The word major landed like an artillery round. Caldwell's face drained the color of old gauze. I don't know what you're talking about. She's a nurse. A pediatric nurse who, her son pulled out a secure phone, made one call, and within 4 minutes a white-faced administrator appeared with a classified file folder marked Special Access. The room's fluorescent lights hummed their eternal industrial hum. The administrator's hands trembled as she opened the file. Navy Cross, she read, her voice hollow. The word seemed to echo. She looked up at Caldwell, then back at the document. 2 silver stars. 3 commendations for valor under fire. Bronze star with combat VE medical discharge, 2019, following combat-related injury. Each decoration was its own sentence now, each its own terrible revelation. A SEAL team leader who'd arrived on the helicopter stood in the corner, uniform immaculate, and began to speak. His voice was the kind that made bone-thin and precise, Navy Cross. That's the 3rd highest military decoration in America. Silver Star. 2 of them. She earned those at 26 years old. He paused. Let the silence build. General Hayes was wounded at 08 for 7 hours in Sanjin Valley. Elena operated on him for 47 minutes in a collapsed aid station. Under fire. While bleeding herself. 17 other operators made it home that day because of what she did. Caldwell opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The administrator was still reading, still trembling, field surgical training. Expert certification in combat trauma medicine. Classified operations designator. Decorated operator with 160th SAW coordination. She was never a wannabe. She was the real thing. And that's when the real nightmare for Dr. Caldwell began. 2 FBI agents walked into the administrative wing at 09 for 7 hours. They didn't have an arrest warrant yet, but they had something better, forensic evidence. One agent approached Caldwell with the kind of calm that comes from having already won. Dr. Caldwell, we've been investigating anomalies in your controlled substance requisitions for 8 months. When you learned Major Martinez was assigned to General Hayes's care, you recognized her credentials would allow her to spot what you'd been doing: medication discrepancies, supply requisitions that didn't match patient census, altered logs going back to February of last year. The agent opened his laptop. On screen, red-flagged entries, timestamps edited and then re-edited, Caldwell's user ID on access logs for systems he had no clearance to touch. You tried to cover your diversion scheme by fabricating cause for her termination. You made 3 phone calls after she saved the general's life. 1 to the hospital board. 1 to the VA liaison. 1 to risk management. Those calls triggered digital forensic alerts because you accessed personnel systems you weren't authorized to access. You forged documentation last night to justify her suspension. The agent closed the laptop. That's federal offense number 4, by the way. The opioid diversion is 1 through 3. Caldwell's hands, surgeon's hands, steady hands that had held a scalpel, were shaking now. The administrator watched him stand, watched as one agent secured his wrists with handcuffs that clicked with the precision of a closing door. Caldwell's mouth moved but produced only air. The other agent recited Miranda rights in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. By 1015 hours, Dr. Caldwell was in the back of an unmarked sedan, medical license suspended pending investigation, career burning like a flare on a dark night. The hospital security footage of his handcuffed walk to the vehicle would circulate through staff channels like wildfire by lunch. Elena stood in her living room watching the Portland rain hammer the windows, the sound like applause for a show she'd never wanted to perform in. Her son sat beside her, still in uniform. General Hayes called her phone at 1847 hours, his voice steady, grateful, free of the morphine that had clouded it for the first 48 hours of his recovery. He described the field operation in precise clinical language that only another survivor would understand. He told her he'd requested Oak Creek Memorial specifically because he'd traced her here. He wanted to thank her. He wanted the world to know what she'd done. She listened without speaking, her fingers unconsciously reaching for the scar on her shoulder beneath her civilian clothes, the shrapnel wound that still ached when the pressure dropped. 6 months later, the rain had passed, and the September sun bent across Portland in that particular way that makes everything look like it's being filmed. Elena moved through the hospital's glass entrance doors, and through those same doors, she could see Dr. Caldwell. He sat at a folding table outside the grocery store across the street, a stack of supplemental insurance pamphlets in front of him, a name badge that said Sales Associate clipped to a polyester shirt. His medical license was gone. His career was ash. He was awaiting trial on federal charges, and he was selling insurance policies to people who didn't recognize him. When he saw her through the window, even at that distance, he looked away. Quickly. Like an animal that recognizes a predator. Inside Oak Creek Memorial, the conference room had been transformed. Banners. Flowers in arrangements that must have cost $300. Hospital staff in dress clothes filled every seat. General Hayes stood at the podium in his service dress uniform, the fabric pressed to knife blade precision, his movement down the aisle still carrying a slight hitch on his left side, the side where Elena's improvised chest seal and field medicine had saved his life. The scar tissue still healed beneath his uniform. He would carry it forever. He would carry it with gratitude. Major Elena Martinez performed surgery under direct fire for 47 minutes, General Hayes said, his voice the kind that travels to the back of a room without raising volume, using supplies from a destroyed aid station. With fragmentation wounds of her own. 17 operators came home because of what she did that day. He paused. Let his eyes scan the room, make contact with staff members who had whispered about Elena, who had accepted Caldwell's characterization of her as a troublemaker, a rule breaker, someone trying to be something she wasn't. I learned she was here at Oak Creek Memorial. I requested transfer to this hospital specifically so I could find her. To thank her. To tell her that what she did matters. Elena sat in the front row wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 6 years, her major's oak leaves catching the light like small medals of their own. Her son sat beside her, his uniform crisp, his face proud in the way that only family could manage. The hospital's CEO approached Elena with a folder. Inside was a formal apology. Inside was reinstatement. Inside was an offer, ICU clinical director. Full authority. Full trust. Hayes presented her with Oak Creek Memorial's Humanitarian Award, a bronze sculpture of hands holding hands, and when he placed it in her palms, he didn't let go immediately. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Elena's speech was brief. She stood, accepted the award, and when she spoke, her voice had changed. It was no longer deferential. It was no longer seeking permission to speak. It was the voice of someone who had made decisions that mattered, who had held lives in her hands, who had understood that hesitation could mean death. "I didn't save General Hayes because of his rank. I saved him because that's what we do. We help people who need help. That's what I did in Helmand Province. That's what I will continue to do here." She paused. Let her eyes move across the room, across every face, including those who had whispered, who had judged, who had believed Caldwell's lies. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The room erupted. Standing ovation. The kind where people clap until their hands burn. Afterward, in the hallway, Elena walked past the supply closet where Caldwell had cornered her, where he'd breathed coffee and threats into the sterile air. Her son walked beside her. He asked if she was okay. She nodded. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." General Hayes joined them, his uniform decorations catching the light, each one a story, each one purchased in blood. He produced something from his pocket, 2 dog tags on a repaired chain. One was his. One was her son's unit designation. "I kept mine broken on purpose," Hayes said, waiting to return it in person. "So you'd know what your mother did." He placed the chain in her son's palm, and for a moment the three of them stood in that hallway, under those humming fluorescent lights, and something shifted. Something that had been fractured was being made whole. Elena had spent 2 years being someone she wasn't, the quiet nurse, the deferential subordinate, the woman hiding what she could do. The woman hiding who she was. In 48 hours, all of that had changed. The truth had arrived on Black Hawks. The truth had walked through doors in dress uniform. The truth had burned a career to the ground and rebuilt one from justice. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever had to hide who you really are to survive in a world that wasn't ready for you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. And comment, would you have spoken up sooner, or would you have done what Elena did, protected your secret until the moment it mattered most? Let me know. And share this with someone who needs to know that heroes don't always announce themselves.